Well, you guys really seem to enjoy that win-win trades video, so why don't we do a sequel this week? This week we're going to talk about the biggest lose-lose trades I could find in recent MLB history. Trades where both teams were probably better off just not making the deal in the first place. Now, before we kick off today's video, I just want to say lose-lose trades are kind of weird to highlight because one team usually comes out a little bit better than the other team, but I wanted to highlight these trades specifically because they're just kind of messy in general, and that's what defines them in my brain as lose-lose. You guys get the idea. Let's dive right in. And if you enjoyed today's video, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. Also ring that bell for all future notifications so you don't miss a single Jai-All video. Let's kick off our lose-lose list the same way we did our win-win list, with the most recent example I could find. This one tracks back to the 2021 trade deadline, with a combo of two teams that normally don't link up. The White Sox were handily reigning over the American League Central. God, remember those days? But they needed a little bit more firepower in their bullpen. The Cubs' massive losing streak sent them into a massive fire sale where they sold off the likes of Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, Javier Baez, and for this specific deal, closer Craig Kimbrel. After a pair of lackluster seasons on the north side, Kimbrel was arguably the best closer in the game in the first half of that season, allowing just 2 earned runs in 36 innings while locking down 23 saves. But in his new setup role behind Liam Hendricks on the south side, Kimbrel returned to his struggles with an ERA over 5 in 25 games and was gone after the end of the season. But what was looked at the time as a huge overpay for a rental reliever in Kimbrel turned out to be a surprisingly lackluster package. Now, the book isn't closed on Nick Madrigal, but he certainly hasn't impressed so far on the Cubs roster. Known as a batting average bat with plus defense, he regressed on both sides of the ball in 2022, and with the addition of Dansby Swanson and the emergence of Nico Hoerner, it's hard to see him as anything more than a bench piece right now. Madrigal is currently worth negative WAR this season, and it's not helped by the disappearance of another piece in this deal, Cody Heuer. After a solid 2020 season, he regressed in the season that followed before having to undergo Tommy John surgery. He's on his way back for this year, but for now, him and Madrigal haven't panned out the way the Cubs have hoped so far. As for WAR exchange, Kimbrel held no value while Madrigal and Heuer have barely combined for 1 win so far. These pieces probably were better off used elsewhere. But Madrigal and Heuer have time to rewrite the narrative on that and make that part of the video age pretty poorly. As for these other trades, it's kind of set in stone. Let's go back to the mid-2010s for our next trade. Bud Norris had been the most reliable starter for some pretty poor Houston Astros teams during the late 2000s. After tossing nearly 700 innings in a 5-year stretch, the Astros decided to trade Norris in the midst of their 3rd consecutive 100-loss season. After coming off a strong first half, Norris was traded to the rejuvenated Baltimore Orioles, who were hoping to make the playoffs for a 2nd year in a row. On the day after the trade, the Astros were already in Baltimore playing the Orioles, so Norris just switched dugouts and ended up winning that game. The Orioles won most games started by Norris in the second half of that season, despite his poor numbers. He pitched well in 2014, though, as a solid cog of the Orioles' rotation, even winning a playoff start for them in the ALDS with 6 shutout innings against the Tigers. Had he not come back for 2015, this trade almost certainly would have been a win for the Orioles, but Norris and the Orioles agreed to an $8.8 million contract, and he was so bad in the year that followed that Baltimore ended up releasing him halfway through the season. This could have been remembered as an all-time lopsided trade considering what Baltimore gave up to get him, trading Josh Hader over to Houston in return. That is, until the Astros flipped Hader again before he could reach the big leagues, packaging him with 3 other prospects for Mike Fiers and Carlos Gomez at the 2015 trade deadline. In total, Norris was worth less than 1 win in 3 years for Birdland, while the pieces acquired for Hader in the second trade were worth even less than that. This was an absolute mess on both sides of the deal here, and imagine the kind of player the Orioles could have got for Hader had they held on to him a little bit longer. Keeping things with the Astros and an AL East team, they made one of the more perplexing moves of the 2009 trade deadline with a move they decided not to make. In the midst of a 3-year playoff drought, the Astros were .500 at the deadline when they decided to keep longtime franchise face Lance Berkman instead of flipping him for a massive haul. The Astros were headed towards dark times, and they went on to finish 74-88 that year, so they were probably better off selling and disassembling their core. Come next year's deadline, they were faced with trading Berkman again, this time for a far less lucrative package since he was only a rental. They found a suitor in the defending champion New York Yankees, and instead of a group of impressive prospects, they were only able to land reliever Mark Melancon and unranked outfield prospect Jimmy Paredes. Melancon was admittedly solid during his time with the Astros, with an ERA under 3 in over 90 innings with 20 saves in a pair of seasons. However, Houston put way too much pressure on Paredes, calling him up straight away from AA as a 22-year-old and making him a regular face on their series of 100-loss teams that I mentioned before. But perennial MVP candidate Lance Berkman never fit in quite right over in the Bronx. Berkman hit just 1 home run in 37 games with the Yankees, putting up below average numbers on both sides of the ball. He came up with this huge playoff home run, but but overall this deal was not worth it. He also rubbed salt in the wound of this trade by signing with St. Louis that offseason and returning to All-Star form, clubbing over 30 home runs with over 90 walks and helping the Cardinals win the World Series in 2011. In terms of WAR exchange, Jimmy Paredes completely undid the solid showing out of the bullpen by Mark Melancon, while Lance Berkman was worth negative WAR in his brief time in the Bronx. So both the Yankees and the Astros came out the other side with negative value on this one. Let's go back another 5 years from this point and talk about one of the greatest starting pitchers of the 1990s, David Wells. After dominating a decade, Wells was approaching the end of his career in 2006 in the second year of a deal with the Red Sox and recovering from right knee surgery at the ripe young age of 43 years old. In the first half of 2006, he made just 8 starts with an ERA near 5. But on the other side of the country, the Padres were in the midst of their third consecutive winning season, trying to conquer the lowly National League West for a second year in a row. Remember when the National League West was bad? Their starting rotation actually ranked tops in the National League with a 4.10 staff ERA that year, but they were looking to add to that group to replace some injured players. After putting together a healthy month in August, the Red Sox made David Wells available with another year left still on his contract. The Padres made an admittedly risky move, trading for the injury-prone and aging David Wells and sending over their number 2 prospect to Boston in the process. Wells made 5 decent starts for the Padres in September, though San Diego lost the majority of them, including the lone playoff start he made in the National League Division Series against the Cardinals. Wells was so bad the following season that the Padres released him after 22 starts in what would become his final season. Luckily for San Diego, trading one of their best minor league players didn't come back to bite them. Catcher George Kataris never caught on with Boston, with a 77 OPS plus and a 48-game sample over 2 seasons. He'd have some decent years down the line, but he produced negative value during his time in Boston and missed out on their championship years. Overall, both teams probably would have been better off just not making this deal in the first place. This next one also took place in the late 2000s, and in all honesty, it's just flat out weird. One season into a 3-year contract, the Cubs were already fed up with Milton Bradley. A handful of suspensions, clubhouse arguments, and rifts with teammates and coaches caused Chicago to move Bradley just 1 year after signing him for $30 million, even despite his decent production. They luckily found a suitor in the Seattle Mariners, though they obviously knew dealing damaged goods meant they weren't going to get a lot in return. In the offseason of 2009, the Mariners acquired Bradley to try and return to the playoffs in exchange for starting pitcher Carlos Silva. Over in the Pacific Northwest, Bradley regressed even further. Some injuries, lack of hustle highlights, ditching the team mid-game, and far worse statistics made this pairing a living hell for both sides, and this would be Bradley's final stints before all teams decided he simply wasn't worth the liability. On the other side, the Cubs were inheriting a starting pitcher who had compiled an ERA near 7 in 34 starts over the past 2 seasons. Silva was solid through his first 15 starts of 2010, with an ERA under 3 at the end of June, but injuries derailed his second half of play as he watched his ERA balloon and the Cubs' record tumble below 500. Despite being age 31, this would be Silva's final MLB season as the Cubs cut him in spring training the following season. Silva definitely wasn't bad as a Chicago Cub with a WAR value near 2 in his lone season, but the Cubs were initially taking a risk trading Bradley, having to eat $20 million for trading away a guy who made an all-star team and received MVP votes just 2 years prior. Would they have been better off just trying to get him to return to that form? Maybe, but like most moves the Mariners made in the 2010s, this one blew up in their face as well, and Bradley provided a negative WAR value in his forgettable 2-year stint with Seattle. The last trade I want to highlight today wasn't exactly a 1-for-1 swap, but it really does come down to these 2 starting pitchers that swap sides. When you think of the name Ubaldo Jimenez, you probably think of 2 things: him conquering Coors Field and throwing the first Rockies no-hitter, or him getting used instead of Zach Britton and giving up this absolute cockshot to Edwin Encarnacion to end the Orioles' 2016 season. But in between those 2 moments, he was a part of the Cleveland organization after Colorado traded him at the 2011 trade deadline, to the dismay of many fans. The Rockies were 5 games below 500 at the time, but to see arguably the greatest pitcher in that franchise's history get flipped was a shocking move, especially with 2 more years of control left on his contract. But his time in Cleveland was not nearly as fruitful as his time in the purple and black. The 500 record Indians thought they were getting a potential ace caliber pitcher, but Jimenez had an ERA over 5 in back-to-back seasons in Cleveland. The club also lost the majority of his starts in the latter half of 2011 when they were pushing for their first playoff berth in 4 years. Luckily for them, Jimenez was fantastic in his final year in 2013 with a 3.30 ERA in 32 starts and nearly 200 strikeouts on the year. After tanking the rotation for 2 years, he helped anchor the rotation and lead the staff to a 92-win season and wildcard berth. He ended up landing a nice 4-year deal with the Orioles after that season. After being worth a negative .7 WAR in his first 2 Cleveland years, he put together a 2.7 WAR season to almost rectify the trade for the Indians. I never mentioned even who they gave up to get Ubaldo in the first place. It was a 4-player package with 3 of the prospects never really panning out. It was the player to be named later, Drew Pomeranz, that turned into the most promising piece. Pomeranz, like most pitchers, did not fare well in his time in Colorado, with an ERA over 5 and 32 starts over a 3-year span. The Rockies decided to give up on him, flipping him to Oakland in exchange for Brett Anderson. Anderson was good for Colorado, but he only made 8 starts before getting injured in his lone year there. Meanwhile, Pomeranz blossomed in Oakland with an ERA near 3.0 and 150 innings over 2 years as a spot starter and long reliever for the A's. This was definitely a piece that both the Rockies and Cleveland could have benefited from. Overall, the war exchange for Ubaldo and Pomeranz was pretty close, with both teams not getting the exact production they were expecting out of this deal. Had Colorado held on to Pomeranz or Ubaldo had been good for all 3 years in Cleveland, you could have argued one side would have come out the winner. Instead, this transaction ended up mostly being a headache for both teams involved. And those are the trades I picked out for today. Lose-lose trades are kind of hard to hammer down because one side always comes out a little bit better than the other, but mostly I just wanted to highlight these trades because they're kind of just messes in general. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure you leave a like and a suggestion for a future trade video you'd like to see on this channel. And as always, subscribe to the Jolly Olive channel if you've been enjoying these videos and ring that bell for all future notifications. But before you go, let's hear a word from today's sponsor,
Lightbox. Guys, there's a lot of special occasions around this time of year, most notably Mother's Day. And I know we usually go with clothes or flowers, and that's all special and good, but if you really want to step up your game this year, you can go for some lab-grown diamonds, some absolutely stunning necklaces and earrings over at Lightbox if you click the link in my description. Whether it's for mom or your significant other, someone special in your life, I highly recommend checking out Lightbox's collection of very special jewelry with the link in the description. It's diamonds and jewels that you'll love with price tags that you'll understand. You can be the MVP of Mother's Day or your anniversary right now with promo code JollyOlive10, that's my channel name, 10 at Lightbox right now. You can get 10% off your purchase. Click the link in my description, shop some Lightbox lab-grown diamonds, code JollyOlive10. You know, be the MVP this year. Give them a gift that they'll remember forever. Thank you to Lightbox for sponsoring today's video, and I'll see you guys next time.